Here in Eastern Europe, there are no other ideologies that invoke as much disdain as Marxism and Nazism. Often, both of these ideologies are compared as equals, and in some countries, they are outright banned. And if you look at Poland and you read a couple of Polish writers, they will explain to you that for them, there was not much of a difference between Nazism and Marxism. And I think this requires a little bit of looking into. After all, these ideologies are quite separate from one another, and their members outright hate each other to the point where they are willing to commit acts of violence towards each other. So, why is this comparison happening again and again? Well, let's look at what is Marxism. What is the fundamental building block of Marxism? Marxism cannot exist without conflict. Its core fundamental is based on the idea of the class struggle. For a Marxist, they like to place human beings into different factions, into collectives that they call as classes. As such, there are two major classes that can be distinguished. On one hand, we have the working class, or as they call it, the proletariat, which is highlighted at being at odds in terms of interests with the ruling class, especially the ones that own the means of production, which are referred to collectively as the bourgeoisie. So in the Marxist framing, the proletariat are seen as the protagonists, the good guys, the victimized group, while the bourgeoisie are seen as the perpetrators of their subjugation. Because of this, the bourgeoisie are seen as antagonistic to the proletariat and called social parasites by proponents of Marxism. If we look at history and we notice what happens during most communist revolutions, much of the bourgeoisie, at least those who fail to escape the clutches of the revolution, are executed en masse in a collective punishment. And oftentimes, even the children of these victims are not spared, because the justice is harsh, swift, and merciless. The motivation of revenge for perceived wrong is absolute, and in the minds of those participating in the violence, it is completely justified. The danger, it seems, that Marxism defines who is and isn't a victim, who is and isn't a perpetrator, by the sole fact of class designation. So it doesn't matter if you're a good bourgeoisie, because such thing by definition cannot exist. And it doesn't matter if you're an evil proletariat, because by definition such a thing does not exist. And if you read a lot of Marxist papers and Marxist literature from the time, you will see how the Marxists would infantilize the proletariat, how the proletariat could never do anything wrong, and because of that they would constantly demand more rights for the proletariat while trying to remove every single responsibility that the proletariat had. And at the same time, they would exaggerate, they would go overboard when describing the mistakes or the evils of the bourgeoisie. So the world is now viewed in black and white. You have black as the bourgeoisie, the evil people, and white being the proletariat, the protagonists. And all that is required to convince the mob to do harm to a person is to make the mob convinced that person is part of the bourgeoisie or he is an ally of them. So I suppose all of Marxist philosophy could be reduced to the following logic. The proletariat is a victim of oppression by the bourgeoisie. Therefore, justice is done by eliminating the bourgeoisie as a class and distributing their wealth to the victim group, the aforementioned proletariat. In other words, X is oppressed by Y, X eliminates Y, X receives justice, also known as social justice. And this process of eliminating the bourgeoisie follows directly from Marxist philosophy. In China, for example, the revolution started with destroying statues, destroying everything that the revolutionaries considered to be associated with the bourgeoisie or to spread their ideals of capitalism. Their rhetoric was initially that of a peaceful one, that they're only destroying property, they're not hurting actual humans. But when the revolution got power and they realized that there's no one left to challenge them, the rhetoric quickly changed into a very violent one. Now, I want to look a little bit at National Socialism or Nazism, and if there is a YouTube censor watching this video, I want to make it absolutely sure that I do not support nor do I condone Nazism as an ideology or their tactics. I am only talking about them from a historical perspective in order to try to see if there is any comparison. You see, the Nazis, they look at history and they spread people into different factions. Rather than spreading them on class, they view ethnic groups as a sort of extended family. The concept of the Volksdeutsche treats the idea of the German people as an ethnic group, as a collectivity, especially in comparison with other folk. As such, in the Nazi philosophy, the Deutsche Folk are the essential unit of concern, and in their philosophical narrative frame are seen as the protagonists. In this narrative, the Deutsche Folk are viewed as a collective entity, while other folk, including German Jews or the Judenvolk, were seen as parasites and antagonistic to the Deutsche Folk. And again, I do not agree with this framing. I am merely laying out their framing accurately as they would have seen it from their point of view. Now, a lot of people in current day, rightfully so, view their methods as evil or diabolical, but you have to understand the Nazis would have seen themselves as the good guys, by whatever logic was necessary to soothe their conscience. But what I want to say is that their entire philosophy could be boiled down to the following phrase. The Deutsche Folk are a victim to the Judenvolk, and therefore the Deutsche Folk would have to eliminate the Judenvolk and extract their wealth for redistribution to the victim group, the Deutsche Folk. And here we have the startling similarity. X is victim to Y, X should eliminate Y, X receives justice, and the material possessions that Y held should now be spread to X. There are many ideologies that operate based on the same frame network, and I'm sure if you watch television, you're probably going to figure out a couple of them. But all these ideologies that have this core philosophy of spreading people into different collectives, and then using a brush in order to paint one collective as evil and one other collective as the protagonist, are always going to end up with violence and oppression. And the most interesting aspect here is that both the Nazis and the Marxists viewed themselves as the underdog. They viewed themselves as being oppressed, while at the same time delivering oppression towards others. Both of these philosophies followed a heroic narrative which parallels many mythological hero figures in human history. Nothing moves a person's emotions like a story of a victim getting the upper hand against an oppressor, especially an undeserving one. However, both of these philosophies led to atrocities on a scale rarely seen in human history. As such, it is not a coincidence that both of these philosophies follow the same formula. It is because they are elementally the same at their core. Only they have applied their archetypical characterizations onto different subjects. It is unsurprising that they have both resulted in millions of deaths. What I find fascinating is that the ideologies that constantly talk about oppression and make it their core value to side with one group of people over another eventually leads with more oppression. While a nation like the United States, which started as a group of conquerors, taking away the land from other people and then bringing in slaves and having in segregation and redlining, that nation, over the course of time, turned better because their ideology wasn't that of oppression. It was an ideology of liberty, which can be found in the American Constitution. And it was the American Constitution which eventually brought the abolition of slavery and believed that all men are created equal, a concept that was quite revolutionary for its time. And today, say what you want and look at America's evil as much as you want, but there is one fact that remains clear. There are a lot more people that want to go to the United States than there are people who try to leave the United States. Can you say the same for Nazi Germany? Can you say the same for the USSR? I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing to my channel. If you liked it a lot, please consider sharing it. And if you liked it so much, then please consider donating something to my Subscribestar or my PayPal. Link is in the description, and I'll see you guys in the comment sections.